Today, there are over 8 billion humans living on Earth. We're everywhere. Every continent except Antarctica, every climate zone, from the frozen Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to scorching deserts. We've built cities in places that should be uninhabitable, Dubai rising from desert sands, Singapore carved from swampland, Las Vegas blooming in a wasteland. We dominate this planet like no species ever has. However, if you had looked at the world 300,000 years ago, the picture would have been shockingly different. There were maybe 10,000 humans total, all living in a small corner of Africa. Not spread across 6 continents, not 8 billion strong, just a few thousand individuals clustered around the Great Rift Valley. That's it. The entire future of human civilization contained within an area smaller than modern-day Kenya. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So, subscribe maybe and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. You know that feeling when you realize how far you've traveled from home? Like when you're standing on a mountain in another country, looking at a landscape that's nothing like where you grew up. That's what happened to our entire species. Except it wasn't a vacation. It was the greatest migration in the history of life on Earth. And here's the really crazy part. Nobody fully understood how this happened until recently. See, scientists had always known humans originated in Africa and somehow spread everywhere else. The fossil evidence was clear enough. But the details, when exactly did we leave? How many times? Which routes did we take? How did we survive in environments so different from our African homeland? These questions had puzzled researchers for decades. The story starts with a breakthrough that happened just over 20 years ago. Scientists had developed techniques to extract DNA not just from living people, but from ancient bones, fossils tens of thousands of years old. This was revolutionary. For the first time, researchers could trace human migrations not just by looking at where bones were found, but by reading the actual genetic story written in ancient DNA. Then came the Human Genome Project, completed in 2003. Suddenly, scientists could compare the DNA of modern populations around the world with incredible precision, tracking mutations backward through time like a molecular clock. What they found was stunning. Every person outside of Africa, every European, Asian, Australian, Native American, Pacific Islander could trace their ancestry back to a single population that left Africa around 70,000 years ago. Not multiple exodus events over hundreds of thousands of years. One group, one journey that changed everything. But that was just the beginning of the story. Now you might think, okay, so humans walked out of Africa and spread around the world. Big deal. Animals migrate all the time, right? Wrong. What humans did was unprecedented in the history of complex life. We didn't just migrate to similar environments like wildebeest following grasslands or birds following seasonal food sources. We deliberately moved into environments that should have killed us. Environments we had no evolutionary adaptations for. And not only did we survive, we thrived. Think about what this actually means. Humans evolved in tropical Africa. Our bodies are designed for year-round warmth, seasonal rainfall, specific types of food sources. Then, in less than 50,000 years, our descendants were living in Siberian permafrost, Australian deserts, Andean mountains 14,000 feet above sea level. This isn't adaptation, it's conquest. And the story of how it happened is more incredible than any science fiction. Let's start at the beginning. 300,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens were living in Africa. Not modern humans exactly, but close enough that if you cleaned one up and put them in contemporary clothes, they might pass for human in a crowd. Their brains were already as large as ours, but they were using relatively simple tools, living in small groups, hunting and gathering in the same regions where their ancestors had lived for millions of years. For 200,000 years, they stayed put. Generation after generation, they lived and died within a few hundred miles of where they were born. They developed language, art, more sophisticated tools, but they remained fundamentally African. During this period, early humans were facing the same challenges that had shaped their evolution for millions of years. The African climate was constantly shifting between wet and dry periods. Forests would expand during humid phases, then contract into tiny refugia when conditions became arid. Animal populations would boom and crash in cycles that lasted thousands of years. But these early humans had developed remarkable adaptability within their African homeland. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of sophisticated hunting strategies, seasonal migration patterns that followed animal herds across hundreds of kilometers, and the development of what anthropologists call symbolic behavior, the creation of art, jewelry, and ritual objects that suggest complex abstract thinking. The Blombos cave site in South Africa contains some of the earliest evidence of human symbolic behavior: engraved ochre pieces, carefully crafted bone tools, and shells that were clearly used as jewelry. These artifacts date to around 100,000 years ago, suggesting that humans had already developed the cognitive capabilities that would eventually allow them to colonize the entire planet. But for tens of thousands of years, they remained in Africa. They had the brains, they had increasingly sophisticated technology, they had complex social organization. So why didn't they leave earlier? The answer lies in the barriers that surrounded Africa during this period. To the north lay the Sahara Desert, which during most of this period was even more extreme than it is today. To the northeast, the narrow corridor between Africa and Asia was blocked by harsh desert conditions and unpredictable climate shifts. To the south lay thousands of kilometers of ocean. Early humans were trapped in Africa not by their own limitations, but by environmental barriers that made expansion extremely dangerous. Small groups did occasionally venture into the Middle East. Fossil evidence shows human presence in Israel and the Levant as early as 120,000 years ago, but these early attempts at expansion failed. The populations died out, leaving behind only scattered tools and bones as evidence of their brief existence. Then something changed. Around 100,000 years ago, the first groups began moving north more systematically toward the Middle East. We know this from fossil sites in Israel and the Levant that contain early human remains dating to this period. But these weren't successful colonizations. The populations died out, leaving empty caves and scattered tools as the only evidence they ever existed. It was like humanity kept trying to break free from Africa and kept failing. Climate would shift, making the northern routes more accessible. Small groups would venture out, establish temporary settlements, maybe survive for a few thousand years. Then conditions would change again. The deserts would expand, water sources would disappear, and the migrants would either return to Africa or vanish entirely. This pattern repeated multiple times over 40,000 years. Humans would probe the edges of their African homeland, establish footholds in the Middle East, then retreat or disappear when conditions became too harsh. Each failed expansion was probably a tragedy for the people involved. Imagine being part of a small band that decided to venture into unknown territory, traveling for months across increasingly harsh landscape, finally establishing a settlement in what seemed like promising territory, only to watch that territory become uninhabitable over the course of a few generations. Archaeological evidence from these early failed settlements is heartbreaking in its sparsity. A few stone tools scattered around what used to be a water source, animal bones showing evidence of systematic butchering, then nothing. The story of entire communities written in a handful of artifacts, then silence. But these failures weren't meaningless. Each attempt taught lessons that would eventually make success possible. Early humans learned about desert survival, seasonal migration patterns, the importance of reliable water sources, techniques for long-distance travel. Most importantly, they developed the psychological capacity to undertake extremely risky journeys into completely unknown territory. The willingness to leave everything familiar and venture into the unknown isn't natural for most animals. Even highly mobile species like migratory birds follow genetically programmed routes to destinations their ancestors have visited for millions of years. What early humans developed was something unprecedented: the capacity for true exploration, driven by curiosity and the ability to imagine better conditions beyond the horizon. But around 75,000 years ago, everything began to change forever. What made the successful exodus different wasn't just luck or better weather, it was technology. Archaeological evidence shows that around 75,000 years ago, humans in Africa began developing what researchers call modern human behavior. Complex tools made from multiple materials, systematic use of fire, sophisticated hunting strategies that could take down the largest animals on the continent. Most importantly, they developed projectile weapons, spears and spear throwers that could kill from a distance. These weren't minor improvements. They were revolutionary technologies that transformed humans from opportunistic scavengers into apex predators. For the first time in human history, small groups could take down massive prey animals. They could hunt in environments where stealth and endurance weren't enough. They could compete directly with lions, leopards, and hyenas for the same food sources. The development of projectile weapons was particularly crucial. Before this innovation, human hunting was limited to persistence hunting, running prey animals to exhaustion over long distances, or scavenging kills made by other predators. Both strategies worked in familiar African environments where humans understood animal behavior and terrain features, but projectile weapons changed everything. With spear throwers, small groups of humans could hunt successfully in completely unfamiliar territory. They could take down prey species they had never encountered before. They could hunt effectively even when they didn't understand local animal migration patterns or behavior. This was the technological breakthrough that made global expansion possible. For the first time, humans could venture into unknown environments with confidence that they could find food, even if everything else was unfamiliar. But perhaps the most crucial development was clothing. Genetic analysis of human body lice suggests that humans began wearing clothes regularly around 70,000 years ago. This timing isn't coincidental. Clothing was the technology that made human migration possible. See, human bodies are designed for African climates. We have minimal body hair, efficient cooling systems, dark skin to protect against intense UV radiation. These are perfect adaptations for tropical environments, but they're liabilities everywhere else. Clothing changed everything. With animal hides and furs, humans could regulate their body temperature artificially. They could venture into environments that would otherwise kill them within hours. They could hunt in cold weather, sleep through freezing nights, cross mountain ranges that should have been impassable barriers. The development of clothing technology required multiple innovations. Humans had to learn how to properly skin animals to preserve large pieces of hide. They needed to develop techniques for tanning hides to prevent rot and maintain flexibility. Most importantly, they had to invent sewing, using bone needles and sinew thread to create fitted garments that would stay on during active movement. Archaeological evidence shows that by 70,000 years ago, humans had developed sophisticated sewing technology. Bone needles found at sites across Africa show evidence of systematic production and use. These weren't crude awls for punching holes. They were precisely crafted tools with polished surfaces and carefully shaped eyes, designed for creating complex stitching patterns. The social implications of clothing technology were equally important. Creating fitted clothing required cooperation between specialists. Someone had to be skilled at hunting the right animals. Others needed expertise in hide preparation and tanning. Still others had to master the precision work of sewing. This division of labor created interdependence within groups and encouraged the sharing of technical knowledge. Around 70,000 years ago, armed with these new technologies, a group of humans left Africa for good, not through the northern route into the Middle East, but through a completely different path that would change the course of human history. They crossed the Red Sea. Now, this doesn't sound like a big deal until you realize what it actually required. The Red Sea, even during ice ages when sea levels were much lower, was still a significant body of water. Crossing it required boats, not just logs or accidental flotation devices, purposefully constructed watercraft capable of carrying multiple people and their supplies across open ocean. This was the first time in human history that any land mammal had deliberately crossed a major water barrier using constructed technology. It was humanity's first step into becoming a truly global species. The crossing probably happened at the narrow strait between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, a distance of maybe 20 to 30 kilometers at the time. But even this short journey was extraordinarily risky. Open water, strong currents, the possibility of storms or equipment failure far from shore. Building seaworthy boats required yet another set of technological innovations. Early boat builders had to understand the properties of different materials, which woods were buoyant, how to bind materials together to create watertight seals, techniques for waterproofing using plant resins and animal fats. They needed to develop paddles, understand basic principles of navigation, create systems for distributing weight to maintain stability. Most challenging of all, they had to do this without any prior experience of ocean travel. Unlike modern shipbuilders who can learn from thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, these early mariners were inventing seafaring technology from scratch. The psychological barriers were probably as significant as the technical ones. For people who had lived their entire lives on solid ground, trusting their lives to a constructed craft floating on deep water required enormous courage. The decision to attempt the crossing represented a fundamental shift in human relationship with the natural world, from passive adaptation to active technological mastery. Yet they made it. And once they reached the Arabian Peninsula, they found themselves in a completely new world. 70,000 years ago, Arabia wasn't the harsh desert it is today. Ice Age conditions had shifted global weather patterns, creating a green Arabia with rivers, lakes, and grasslands. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of human settlements throughout the peninsula, complete with sophisticated stone tools and evidence of systematic hunting. The Arabia that early migrants encountered was like a tropical paradise compared to the harsh conditions they had left behind in Africa. Reliable water sources, abundant game animals, plant foods that were similar enough to African varieties to be immediately useful. For the first time in human history, a migrant population found itself in an environment that was actually better than their homeland. This created ideal conditions for population growth. Unlike the failed attempts at Middle Eastern colonization, where migrants struggled to survive in marginal environments, the Arabian settlements prospered. Archaeological evidence suggests rapid population growth and the development of increasingly sophisticated technologies adapted to Arabian conditions. But the migrants couldn't stay in this Arabian paradise forever. Climate was shifting constantly during the Ice Age. What had been grassland could become desert within a few generations. The humans who had risked everything to cross the Red Sea now faced a choice: adapt to changing conditions or keep moving. They chose to keep moving. And this decision launched the most spectacular expansion in the history of complex life. The success of the Arabian settlements created a launching pad for further expansion. Instead of small, desperate groups fleeing deteriorating conditions, future migrants could draw on the resources and knowledge of established populations. They could time their movements to take advantage of favorable weather patterns. Most importantly, they could maintain connections with Arabian populations that served as refuges if expansion attempts failed. Some groups headed north, following river valleys toward the Mediterranean and eventually into Europe. Others moved east along the coast of the Indian Ocean, establishing settlements in India, Southeast Asia, and eventually reaching all the way to Australia. But here's what makes this expansion so remarkable. It happened incredibly fast. Genetic analysis suggests that humans reached Australia less than 20,000 years after leaving Africa. In evolutionary terms, this is instantaneous. It would be like deciding to walk from New York to Los Angeles, then suddenly appearing in LA before you'd had time to get tired. The speed of human expansion tells us something crucial about our species. We weren't just migrating randomly, following food sources or avoiding predators. We were deliberately exploring, systematically colonizing new environments, driven by something that no other species possessed: curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. This systematic exploration required unprecedented levels of organization and communication. Successful expansion depended on the ability to share information between groups separated by hundreds or thousands of kilometers. Scouts would venture into unknown territory, then return with detailed information about resources, hazards, and travel routes. This information had to be preserved and transmitted accurately to future migrants. Archaeological evidence suggests that early human populations developed sophisticated information-sharing networks. Similar tool technologies appear at sites separated by thousands of kilometers, suggesting rapid transmission of technical knowledge. Trade materials show up far from their sources, indicating regular contact between distant populations. Most importantly, genetic analysis reveals that migrating populations maintained contact with their parent groups for thousands of years after initial separation. This wasn't random dispersal. It was coordinated expansion that preserved connections between far-flung human communities. This is where the story gets really incredible, because the environments humans encountered outside Africa should have killed them. Take Europe. When humans first arrived around 45,000 years ago, they found a continent locked in Ice Age conditions, winters that lasted 8 months, temperatures that regularly dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, massive glaciers covering Scandinavia and northern Europe, tundra where forests should have been. The humans who entered this frozen wasteland were still essentially tropical Africans. Their bodies had no special adaptations for cold weather. They couldn't hibernate like bears, couldn't grow thick winter coats like woolly mammoths, couldn't burrow underground like Arctic foxes. But they survived. More than survived, they thrived. Within a few thousand years, human populations were spread from Spain to Siberia, hunting mammoth and reindeer, creating sophisticated cave art, developing complex social structures that could coordinate activities across vast territories. The colonization of Ice Age Europe represents one of the most dramatic environmental adaptations in the history of complex life. The migrants who entered Europe encountered not just cold weather, but an entire ecosystem unlike anything that existed in Africa. Ice Age Europe was dominated by what scientists call mammoth steppe, vast grasslands populated by enormous herds of woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer, and other megafauna that had no African equivalents. Hunting these animals required completely different strategies from anything humans had previously developed. African hunting focused on medium-sized antelopes and occasional larger prey like elephants or hippos, but hunting mammoth required coordinated group efforts involving dozens of people, sophisticated trap construction, and the ability to process enormous quantities of meat and other materials. Early European humans developed specialized mammoth hunting techniques that involved driving entire herds over cliffs or into constructed pit traps. These weren't opportunistic hunts. They were engineering projects that required months of preparation and the coordination of multiple groups. Archaeological sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic show evidence of systematic mammoth processing on an industrial scale. Single sites contain the remains of hundreds of mammoths, along with tools, art objects, and living structures made from mammoth bones and hides. The social organization required for mammoth hunting was unprecedented in human history. Previous African hunting typically involved small groups of related individuals, but mammoth hunting required the cooperation of multiple unrelated groups, complex scheduling to coordinate different phases of the hunt, and sophisticated systems for distributing the enormous quantities of resources generated by successful kills. How did they do it? Technology and cooperation. The humans who colonized Ice Age Europe were master tool makers. They created needles for sewing fitted clothing, spear throwers that could take down massive prey from safe distances, oil lamps that could light caves during the endless winter nights. Most importantly, they developed systematic methods for preserving and storing food, allowing them to survive months when hunting was impossible. But technology alone wasn't enough. Survival in Ice Age Europe required unprecedented levels of cooperation. Small bands of 20 to 30 individuals had to coordinate hunting strategies that might involve hundreds of people driving massive herds of reindeer into kill zones. They had to share resources across vast distances, maintaining trade networks that moved tools, raw materials, and information across the continent. Archaeological evidence shows that humans in Ice Age Europe were trading materials across distances of over 500 kilometers. Obsidian from volcanic regions in Central Europe shows up in caves in France. Seashells from the Atlantic coast appear in settlements hundreds of miles inland. This wasn't random exchange. It was systematic commerce requiring complex social organization and communication systems. The development of these trade networks was crucial for survival in Ice Age Europe. Unlike tropical Africa, where most necessary resources were available locally, Ice Age Europe had patchy resource distribution. High-quality stone for tools was available only in certain locations. Sources of pigments for art and body decoration were rare and scattered. Even food resources were highly seasonal and geographically specific. Trade networks allowed European populations to access resources from across the continent without requiring individual groups to travel constantly. A group living near a high-quality flint source could trade stone tools for amber from the Baltic coast, furs from Arctic regions, or shells from Mediterranean areas. These trade relationships also served as information networks. Along with material goods, traders carried knowledge about weather patterns, animal migrations, technological innovations, and territorial changes. This information sharing was crucial for survival in an environment where conditions could change dramatically from year to year. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement of Ice Age Europeans was the development of sophisticated art and symbolic expression. Cave paintings at sites like Lascaux and Altamira represent some of the earliest complex artistic traditions in human history. These weren't simple representations, they were sophisticated compositions that required advanced planning, multiple pigments, and specialized tools. The creation of cave art required social organization beyond anything seen in earlier human populations. Paint had to be manufactured from rare minerals, often requiring long-distance trade to obtain materials. Artistic work had to be coordinated with other group activities. Someone had to be freed from hunting and gathering duties to spend weeks creating complex paintings in deep cave chambers. Most remarkably, cave art shows evidence of artistic traditions that persisted for thousands of years. Styles and techniques were passed down through generations, refined and elaborated over time. This represents the development of cultural transmission systems that could preserve and enhance complex knowledge over periods much longer than individual human lifespans. Meanwhile, other groups were facing completely different challenges. The humans who moved east from Arabia encountered the vast forests and river systems of South and Southeast Asia. No ice age here, but different problems. Tropical diseases, dense jungles, completely unfamiliar food sources. Again, they adapted with stunning speed. Within a few thousand years, human populations were established throughout India, Southeast Asia, and the Indonesian archipelago. They learned to exploit new food sources, tropical fruits, root vegetables, eventually the wild ancestors of rice. They developed new hunting techniques for forest environments. They created boats capable of navigating river systems and coastal waters. The colonization of tropical Asia required adaptations that were completely different from those needed in Ice Age Europe. Instead of dealing with cold and seasonal food shortages, Asian migrants faced year-round heat, humidity, and the challenge of navigating dense forest environments where visibility was limited to a few meters. Tropical forests contain enormous biodiversity, but most of that diversity consists of species that are either inedible or actively dangerous to humans. Unlike African savannas where large game animals were visible from long distances, Asian forests concealed their resources. Finding food required detailed knowledge of which plants were edible at different seasons, which animals could be safely hunted, and how to process potentially toxic foods to make them safe. Early Asian populations developed remarkably sophisticated botanical knowledge. Archaeological sites contain evidence of systematic plant processing, including grinding stones for preparing toxic roots, fermentation vessels for creating alcoholic beverages from tropical fruits, and specialized tools for extracting fibers from forest plants. The development of forest survival skills required different types of social organization than those that evolved in Africa or Europe. Small groups could survive independently in tropical forests more easily than in Ice Age tundra, but they needed detailed local knowledge that could only be accumulated over many generations. This led to the development of extremely stable territorial systems. Unlike European populations that moved seasonally following animal migrations, Asian forest populations tended to remain in the same areas for hundreds of years, developing intimate knowledge of local ecosystems. But the most incredible achievement was yet to come. Around 50,000 years ago, humans reached the coast of Southeast Asia and encountered their greatest challenge yet, the open ocean separating Asia from Australia. This wasn't like the Red Sea crossing, a short hop between visible land masses. This was 90 kilometers of open water to islands that weren't even visible from the mainland. Making this crossing required navigation skills that wouldn't be matched by other cultures for tens of thousands of years. Early Australians had to read ocean currents, understand wind patterns, navigate by stars. They had to build boats capable of carrying entire families across rough seas. Most incredibly, they had to do all this without any guarantee that land existed on the other side. The challenge of reaching Australia cannot be overstated. Even during Ice Age low sea levels, the journey required crossing multiple water barriers, some of them completely out of sight of land. This wasn't coastal hopping, it was open ocean navigation by people who had no previous experience of maritime travel beyond river and coastal environments. The boats required for this journey had to be significantly more sophisticated than anything used for the Red Sea crossing. They needed to be large enough to carry multiple families with supplies, stable enough to handle ocean swells, and robust enough to survive journeys that might take several days. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Australians developed multiple types of watercraft. In northern regions, they built large rafts from bamboo and other buoyant materials. In other areas, they created bark canoes that were lighter and more maneuverable. Some populations developed outrigger technologies that provided stability in rough water. But building seaworthy boats was only part of the challenge. Open ocean navigation required understanding of wind patterns, current systems, and celestial navigation. Early Australians had to learn to read wave patterns that indicated the presence of distant land, understand seasonal changes in weather patterns, and develop systems for maintaining direction during multi-day journeys. Most remarkably, they had to do all this based on the assumption that habitable land existed beyond the horizon. Unlike modern explorers who have maps and satellite images, early Australians were venturing into completely unknown territory based on nothing more than faith and curiosity. Yet they made it. Archaeological evidence shows human presence in Australia by at least 50,000 years ago, possibly earlier. When these early Australians arrived, they found a continent unlike anywhere humans had ever lived. Vast deserts, unique marsupial fauna, plants that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. Once again, humans adapted. Within a few thousand years, they had spread across the entire Australian continent, from tropical rainforests in the north to desert centres to temperate regions in the south. They developed firestick farming, systematically burning landscapes to encourage the growth of food plants. They created some of the world's earliest rock art, capturing their new environment in permanent images. They established trade networks that moved materials and ideas across thousands of kilometres. The colonisation of Australia represents perhaps the most impressive feat of environmental adaptation in human history. The migrants who reached Australia found ecosystems that had no parallels anywhere else on Earth. The large mammals were all marsupials, kangaroos, wombats, and other species that behaved completely differently from the placental mammals that humans had evolved alongside in Africa and Asia. Plant communities were equally unfamiliar. Australian vegetation is dominated by eucalyptus and acacia species that have chemical defences against herbivores. Many Australian plants are toxic to humans unless properly processed. Others are edible only at specific times of year or require complex preparation techniques. Early Australians had to learn entirely new hunting strategies. Kangaroos couldn't be hunted using techniques developed for African antelopes or Asian deer. They moved differently, lived in different social groups, and required different approaches. Other Australian prey species, wombats, echidnas, various bird species, all required specialised techniques. But perhaps most challenging of all, early Australians had to learn to live in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Central Australia contains some of the most arid regions on any continent. Water sources are separated by hundreds of kilometres. Temperatures can exceed 50 degrees Celsius during the day and drop below freezing at night. Survival in these environments required unprecedented levels of environmental knowledge. Early Australians learned to find water by reading subtle changes in vegetation patterns, following animal tracks, and understanding underground water systems. They developed techniques for navigating across featureless landscapes using star positions, wind patterns, and other environmental cues. Most remarkably, they developed sustainable resource management systems that allowed them to thrive in these harsh environments for thousands of years. Firestick farming involved systematically burning grasslands and forests to encourage the growth of food plants and create habitat for prey animals. This wasn't random burning, it was sophisticated ecosystem management based on detailed understanding of plant and animal ecology. But the Australian colonisation revealed something else about human expansion. It was often devastating to existing ecosystems. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, Australia lost most of its megafauna. Giant wombats, enormous kangaroos, massive flightless birds, species that had survived millions of years of environmental change disappeared shortly after humans arrived. Similar patterns occurred everywhere humans colonized. Europe lost its woolly mammoths and giant cave bears. The Americas would later lose giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and massive bison species. Humans weren't just adapting to new environments. They were transforming them, becoming an ecological force powerful enough to drive other species extinct. This was unprecedented for any large mammal. Most species that expand into new territories either adapt to existing ecosystems or fail to establish permanent populations. Humans rewrote the rules entirely. The extinction of Australian megafauna probably resulted from a combination of human hunting pressure and environmental modification. Large, slow-reproducing species were particularly vulnerable to even modest increases in mortality rates. The systematic burning practices that helped humans manage their environment also changed vegetation patterns in ways that may have disadvantaged large herbivores. But these extinctions weren't intentional genocide. Early Australians were small populations trying to survive in challenging environments. The ecological impact of their activities accumulated over thousands of years, creating changes that probably weren't apparent to the people causing them. This pattern of ecological transformation would be repeated everywhere humans colonized. Our species didn't just spread across the Earth, we fundamentally altered every ecosystem we entered. Usually within a few thousand years of arrival, the expansion continued relentlessly. From Southeast Asia, humans moved north into China and eventually Siberia. This northward migration required adapting to some of the harshest environments on Earth. Regions where winter temperatures regularly dropped below -50 degrees Celsius, where the ground remained frozen year-round, where the sun disappeared entirely for months at a time. Again, humans not only survived, but prospered. Siberian populations developed sophisticated cold weather technologies, layered clothing systems, efficient heating methods, techniques for hunting Arctic animals. They learned to build shelters from materials available in treeless tundra. They developed social systems that could maintain group cohesion during months of darkness and isolation. The colonization of Siberia required solving problems that had no precedent in human experience. Unlike Ice Age Europe, which was cold but still received sunlight year-round, much of Siberia experiences polar night, months when the sun never rises above the horizon. Surviving these conditions required not just physical adaptations, but psychological resilience to cope with extended periods of darkness and isolation. Siberian populations developed specialized hunting techniques for Arctic animals like reindeer, seal, and mammoth. They learned to predict animal migration patterns across vast tundra landscapes. They created efficient methods for processing and preserving meat in extremely cold conditions. Most importantly, they developed social mechanisms for maintaining cooperation and mental health during the long Arctic winter. Archaeological sites in Siberia show evidence of human presence as early as 45,000 years ago, with populations gradually spreading north and east toward what would eventually become the land bridge connecting Asia to North America. The Siberian populations that eventually colonized North America were among the most cold-adapted humans in history. They had spent thousands of years refining survival technologies for Arctic conditions. They were expert hunters of large mammals, skilled at reading weather patterns and navigating across snow-covered landscapes, experienced in maintaining social cohesion in small groups isolated for months at a time. These skills would prove crucial for the next phase of human expansion, the colonization of the Americas. Because that's where the story takes its most dramatic turn. During the Ice Age, so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped by over 120 meters. This exposed vast areas of land that are now underwater, including a massive plain connecting Siberia to Alaska. This wasn't a narrow bridge, it was a subcontinent, hundreds of kilometers wide, with its own rivers, lakes, and ecosystems. Scientists call this landmass Beringia, and it became the staging ground for humanity's most ambitious colonization yet, the Americas. The humans who crossed into Beringia around 20,000 years ago were the descendants of Siberian populations who had already mastered Arctic survival. They were equipped with the most advanced cold weather technology available, experienced in hunting massive Arctic animals, socially organized enough to coordinate complex migrations across vast distances. But Beringia wasn't just a pathway, it was a refuge. During the height of the Ice Age, much of North America was covered by glaciers thousands of feet thick. The route south was blocked by ice sheets that extended from the Arctic Ocean to the Great Lakes. Early Americans were trapped in Beringia for thousands of years, unable to move further south. This created what scientists call the Beringian Standstill, a period when human populations lived in isolation on the Bering Land Bridge, adapting to its unique environment while waiting for conditions to improve. Beringia during the Ice Age was unlike anywhere else on Earth. It was a vast grassland populated by enormous herds of mammoth, bison, and horses, but it was also one of the coldest environments humans had ever attempted to inhabit. Winter temperatures regularly dropped below -60 degrees Celsius, and the growing season was so short that normal plant foods were largely unavailable. The humans who lived in Beringia developed extreme cold weather adaptations. They created sophisticated multi-layer clothing systems that could maintain body temperature in temperatures that would kill unprotected humans within minutes. They learned to hunt and process massive animals like woolly mammoth that provided enough calories to support groups through the long Arctic winter. Most importantly, they developed social and psychological adaptations for surviving in small groups during months of darkness and extreme cold. Archaeological evidence suggests that Beringian populations maintained rich cultural traditions including storytelling, art, music, and complex ritual practices that help maintain group cohesion during the harshest conditions. Genetic analysis of Native American populations shows evidence of this standstill. All Native Americans descend from a single population that was isolated in Beringia for several thousand years, long enough to develop distinctive genetic signatures that distinguish them from their Asian ancestors. This isolation in Beringia was crucial for the eventual colonization of the Americas. Instead of small, desperate groups fleeing harsh conditions, the populations that eventually moved south were well-adapted Arctic specialists with thousands of years of experience in extreme environments. Then, around 16,000 years ago, the ice began to retreat. Corridors opened between the massive ice sheets covering North America. For the first time in millennia, there was a route south. What happened next was explosive. Within just a few thousand years, humans had spread from Alaska to the tip of South America, a distance of over 17,000 kilometers. Archaeological sites show human presence in Chile by 14,500 years ago, meaning the colonization of two entire continents happened in less than 2,000 years. This is almost incomprehensibly fast. It would be like modern humans deciding to colonize Mars and having permanent settlements established from the polar ice caps to the equator within a single generation. The speed of American colonization tells us that by this point, humans had perfected the art of migration. They weren't just wandering randomly or following game animals. They were systematic explorers, capable of rapidly assessing new environments, developing appropriate technologies, and establishing sustainable populations in previously uninhabited territories. The early Americans encountered environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to high-altitude mountains to vast deserts. They adapted to all of them with remarkable speed. Arctic populations continued their specialized mammoth hunting traditions. Desert populations learned to exploit cacti and other drought-resistant plants. Mountain populations adapted to low oxygen levels and extreme temperature variations. Forest populations in eastern North America developed sophisticated agricultural systems based on the three sisters crops, corn, beans, and squash, that provided complete nutrition and could be grown together in forest clearings. But perhaps most impressively, they did all this while maintaining connections across vast distances. Archaeological evidence shows that within a few thousand years of initial colonization, Native American populations were trading materials across the entire length of both continents. Obsidian from volcanic regions in the western United States shows up in archaeological sites on the Atlantic coast. Seashells from the Gulf of Mexico appear in sites in the Rocky Mountains. This wasn't just local exchange, it was transcontinental commerce, requiring sophisticated social organization and communication systems that could maintain relationships across distances that would challenge modern transportation networks. The trade networks that developed across the Americas were more extensive than anything seen in the Old World at the time. Materials from Alaska show up in archaeological sites in Central America. Copper from the Great Lakes region appears in sites throughout eastern North America. Exotic stones, shells, and other materials traveled thousands of kilometers from their sources. These trade relationships weren't just about material exchange, they were information networks that allowed knowledge about new technologies, environmental changes, and resource opportunities to spread rapidly across both continents. But the speed of American colonization raises important questions. How did small groups of humans spread across two enormous continents so quickly? What allowed them to adapt to such diverse environments in such a short time? The answer lies in the unique characteristics that early Americans brought from their Beringian experience. These weren't random migrants stumbling into unknown territory. They were highly specialized Arctic peoples with thousands of years of experience in extreme environments. They had sophisticated technologies, complex social organization, and most importantly, proven ability to survive in conditions that would kill most other humans. When they encountered temperate forests, tropical beaches, high mountain valleys, they weren't starting from scratch. They were adapting existing technologies and social systems that had been tested in the harshest environments on Earth. The clothing systems developed for Siberian winters could be modified for mountain environments. The hunting techniques that worked on mammoth could be adapted for bison, elk, or caribou. The social organization that maintained cooperation during Arctic winters could coordinate large-scale hunting operations in temperate grasslands. Most importantly, early Americans had inherited the psychological characteristics that made rapid expansion possible. Curiosity about new environments, willingness to take enormous risks, ability to innovate quickly when circumstances required new solutions. By 10,000 years ago, humans had reached every habitable continent. They had established permanent populations in environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests to high-altitude plateaus. They had developed technologies that allowed them to not just survive, but dominate these environments, becoming the apex predator in every ecosystem they entered. But the most incredible part of the human expansion wasn't just its speed or scope, it was its creativity. Every population that encountered a new environment didn't just adapt to existing conditions, they invented entirely new ways of living. Arctic populations developed ice fishing, seal hunting, techniques for building shelters from snow and ice. Desert populations learn to extract water from plants, navigate by stars, survive in regions where water sources were hundreds of kilometers apart. Mountain populations developed high-altitude agriculture, techniques for preventing altitude sickness, methods for surviving in environments where oxygen levels were half those at sea level. Each of these innovations represented solutions to problems that no human had ever faced before. Our species wasn't just migrating, it was constantly reinventing what it meant to be human. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic developed some of the most sophisticated cold weather technologies in human history. Their clothing systems used multiple layers of animal furs arranged to create insulating airspaces while preventing moisture accumulation that could be fatal in sub-zero temperatures. They created specialized tools for ice hunting, including harpoons designed to penetrate thick seal hides, ice picks for creating breathing holes, and sleds that could transport heavy loads across snow and ice. Desert populations like the Aboriginal Australians developed navigation systems that allowed them to cross vast, featureless landscapes with pinpoint accuracy. They learned to read subtle environmental cues, the direction of sand dune formations, the behavior of certain birds, the position of stars, to navigate across hundreds of kilometers of terrain where getting lost meant certain death. Mountain populations in the Andes developed agricultural techniques that allowed them to grow food at altitudes where most plants can't survive. They created terraced fields that maximized water retention and soil depth, developed crop varieties adapted to extreme temperature fluctuations, and established trade networks that moved products between different altitude zones. Tropical populations developed some of the world's first systematic agriculture, learning to cultivate and improve wild plants like bananas, rice, and taro. They created sophisticated water management systems for growing crops in swampy environments, developed techniques for clearing and maintaining forest gardens, and established complex social systems for managing agricultural labor. Each of these achievements required not just individual innovation, but cultural systems that could preserve and transmit complex knowledge across generations. Unlike other animals that rely primarily on instinctive behaviors, humans had to learn almost everything necessary for survival. This created enormous advantages in terms of behavioral flexibility, but it also created enormous risks if knowledge was lost. The solution was the development of sophisticated teaching systems. Every human culture that successfully colonized a new environment developed elaborate methods for training young people in essential survival skills. These weren't just informal learning processes, they were systematic educational programs that ensured crucial knowledge was passed to the next generation. The genetic evidence for this incredible expansion is written in our DNA. Population genetics can trace the routes early humans took with extraordinary precision. They can identify bottlenecks where small populations were isolated for thousands of years, expansion events where populations grew rapidly, mixing events where different groups encountered each other and interbred. What this evidence shows is that human expansion wasn't random. It followed predictable patterns: coastal routes where possible, river valleys when moving inland, mountain passes when crossing barriers. Early humans were systematic explorers using geographic knowledge and environmental awareness that would impress modern navigators. The genetic data reveals the branching pattern of human expansion like a family tree written in DNA. The first major split occurred when humans left Africa, separating African populations from all others. The next split separated European and Asian lineages as migrants spread in different directions from the Middle East. Within Asia, genetic evidence shows multiple expansion events. One branch moved south along the coast toward Australia, another moved north towards Siberia and eventually the Americas. Still another moved west toward Europe, where it mixed with populations that had arrived earlier via Mediterranean routes. Each of these expansions left distinctive genetic signatures that can still be read in modern populations. Europeans carry genetic markers that trace back to Ice Age hunters who survived in refugia during the coldest periods. Asians have genetic variants that reflect adaptations to monsoon climates and high population densities. Native Americans show the genetic signature of the Beringian bottleneck when their ancestors were isolated on the land bridge for thousands of years. But the DNA evidence also reveals something else: how recently all this happened. The genetic diversity of human populations outside Africa is remarkably low compared to African populations. This is the signature of recent expansion from a small founding population. Every person living outside Africa today, whether in Europe, Asia, Australia, or the Americas, can trace their ancestry back to that single group that left Africa 70,000 years ago. In genetic terms, all non-African humans are closely related cousins. The differences we see between populations, skin color, facial features, body size, are recent adaptations to local environments, not fundamental distinctions between different types of humans. A person whose ancestors lived in Northern Europe for 40,000 years and developed pale skin and light hair to maximize vitamin D production in low-light conditions. A person whose ancestors lived in equatorial regions and maintained dark skin for UV protection. A person whose ancestors adapted to high altitudes and developed enhanced oxygen processing capabilities. All are products of the same migration, the same expansion, the same human story. This has profound implications for how we understand human diversity. The variation we see between populations represents one of the most rapid adaptive radiations in the history of complex life. In just 70,000 years, humans diversified across more environmental niches than most species occupy over millions of years of evolution. But we also remained fundamentally the same species. Despite adapting to radically different environments, developing different technologies, and living in isolation for thousands of years, human populations maintained the capacity to interbreed when they encountered each other again. The basic human template, our social organization, communication abilities, technological capacities, remained consistent across all populations. This combination of diversity and unity is what makes the human expansion so remarkable. We became the most widespread mammal on Earth while remaining a single, interconnected species. We adapted to every environment on the planet while maintaining the capacity to recognize and cooperate with humans from completely different backgrounds. The expansion also created the foundation for everything that came afterward. The agricultural revolution that began 10,000 years ago was only possible because humans had already spread to regions with suitable wild grasses and animals for domestication. The rise of civilization required populations that had already developed the social and technological foundations for complex societies. Every major human achievement, from writing systems to mathematics to space exploration, builds on the foundation established during those first 50,000 years of expansion. The curiosity that drove humans to cross the Red Sea 70,000 years ago is the same curiosity that drives modern space exploration. The technological innovation that allowed survival in Ice Age Europe is the same capacity that produced the internet and smartphone technology. The social cooperation that made it possible for small bands to coordinate mammoth hunts across Ice Age landscapes is the same capacity that allows modern societies to coordinate global responses to pandemics or climate change. But perhaps most importantly, the human expansion created the template for how our species responds to challenges. When faced with seemingly impossible barriers, vast oceans, frozen continents, inhospitable deserts, humans don't just adapt to existing conditions. They innovate, they develop new technologies, they create new forms of social organization, they find ways to not just survive, but thrive in environments that should kill them. This is what made the human expansion possible. Not superior strength or speed or specialized adaptations, but the capacity to look at an impossible situation and ask, how can we make this work? then develop the tools, techniques, and social systems to actually do it. The story of how early Americans crossed the Bering Land Bridge illustrates this perfectly. Faced with one of the harshest environments on Earth, they didn't just endure, they mastered it. They developed technologies and social systems so effective that when the Ice Age ended and routes to the south opened up, they were able to colonize 2 entire continents in less than 2,000 years. This same pattern repeated everywhere humans went. Initial populations would establish themselves in challenging frontier conditions, develop specialized technologies and social systems, then use those innovations as launching pads for further expansion. The result was the most spectacular biological expansion in Earth's history. In less than 70,000 years, humans went from a small population confined to tropical Africa to a global species occupying every major landmass except Antarctica. But the expansion wasn't just about geography. It was about the development of human civilization itself. Every major human innovation, language, art, technology, agriculture, writing, mathematics, science, emerged from populations that were dealing with the challenges of living in new environments. Language became more complex as human groups spread across greater distances and needed to coordinate activities between populations that might not see each other for months at a time. Art developed as humans encountered new landscapes and needed ways to record and share information about resources, dangers, and navigation routes. Technology became more sophisticated as humans faced environmental challenges that required new solutions. Agriculture emerged when expanding populations encountered regions with suitable wild plants and animals that could be domesticated. Writing developed when complex societies needed ways to record and transmit information across space and time. Even modern science traces its roots back to the observational skills and experimental thinking that early humans developed while learning to survive in unfamiliar environments. The ability to form hypotheses, test them against reality, and modify behavior based on results. This is exactly what early migrants had to do every time they entered a new environment. Today, we're facing challenges that require the same kind of innovative thinking. Climate change, resource depletion, the challenge of maintaining cooperation in increasingly complex societies. These aren't necessarily more difficult than the challenges our ancestors faced when they decided to cross the Red Sea or navigate to Australia or survive Ice Age Europe. But they require the same qualities that made the human expansion successful: technological innovation, social cooperation, and the willingness to completely reimagine how we live when circumstances demand it. The story of human expansion isn't just about the past. It's about who we are as a species. We are the descendants of individuals who looked at an impossible world and decided to make it possible, who faced environments that should have killed them and instead transformed those environments to support human life. We carry the genetic and cultural legacy of the greatest migration in the history of life on Earth. Every time we solve a problem that seems impossible, we're expressing the same capacities that allowed a small group of tropical Africans to become a global species in less than 50,000 years. The expansion never really ended. Today, we're looking at Mars the way our ancestors once looked across the Red Sea, a dangerous journey to an uninhabitable world that might somehow become home for humans willing to take the risk. 70,000 years ago, it seemed impossible that humans could survive outside the African environments where we evolved. Today, there are cities in Antarctica, permanent settlements in deserts, space stations orbiting the Earth. The same drive that pushed humans out of Africa is pushing us toward becoming a multi-planetary species. And if history is any guide, we'll find a way, because we are the species that doesn't just adapt to the world as it is. We're the species that transforms impossible worlds into human worlds, one innovation at a time. The technologies that allowed early humans to cross the Red Sea were incredibly primitive compared to modern spacecraft, but the underlying capacity is the same. The willingness to risk everything on the assumption that intelligent, cooperative humans can find ways to survive in environments that seem completely hostile to human life. Early humans couldn't have imagined that their descendants would walk on the moon or send robots to Mars, but they possessed the same fundamental drive to explore, to push beyond known boundaries, to see what lies beyond the horizon. The 70,000-year journey from the Horn of Africa to every corner of the Earth isn't just history, it's proof of what humans can accomplish when we combine curiosity, cooperation, and the refusal to accept that anything is truly impossible. From 10,000 people in the Great Rift Valley to 8 billion people on every continent. The greatest story ever told, written in our genes, our technologies, and our endless capacity to make the impossible seem inevitable. That's how humans spread across the earth. Not through strength or luck, but through the uniquely human ability to look at an impossible challenge and ask, what if we tried anyway? And then actually do it. But let's go deeper into what this expansion actually looked like on the ground, because the human story of spreading across Earth isn't just about the big picture. It's about the countless individual moments when small groups of people made impossible decisions that changed everything. Imagine you're part of that first group standing on the shores of the Red Sea 70,000 years ago. You've spent your entire life in Africa. Your parents lived their entire lives in Africa. Your grandparents, great-grandparents, going back hundreds of generations, all African. The idea of leaving the only continent humans have ever known is literally unthinkable. But you're facing a crisis. Maybe the climate is shifting again, making your traditional territories uninhabitable. Maybe your population has grown too large for the available resources. Maybe you're just curious about what lies beyond the horizon. For whatever reason, your small band has decided to attempt something that no human has ever done before. You're looking across 20 kilometers of open ocean toward a landmass that might or might not be habitable. You have crewed boats that have never been tested in open water. You have no idea what's on the other side. If there's fresh water, if there are dangerous predators, if the climate is survivable. You're about to risk everything, your life, your children's lives, your entire genetic lineage, on the hope that somehow things will work out. This is the kind of decision that defined human expansion, not careful, calculated risks based on complete information, desperate leaps of faith into the complete unknown, driven by the uniquely human conviction that intelligence and cooperation can overcome any obstacle. The people who made these decisions weren't superhuman. They were ordinary humans facing extraordinary circumstances. They felt fear, uncertainty, doubt, all the same emotions we feel when facing difficult choices. But they had something that most other species lack, the ability to imagine a different future and the willingness to sacrifice everything to make that future possible. Think about what crossing the Red Sea actually required at the individual level. Someone had to be the first person to suggest building boats capable of ocean travel. Someone had to figure out how to construct waterproof vessels using materials that had never been used for ocean voyages. Someone had to volunteer to test these boats in dangerous waters. Someone had to convince their family that this insane plan was worth attempting. Every step of human expansion required individuals who were willing to be first to try new technologies, first to venture into unknown territories, first to attempt survival techniques that had never been tested. These weren't necessarily the strongest or smartest people in their groups. They were the people with enough imagination to envision new possibilities and enough courage to act on those visions. The psychological requirements for successful expansion were as demanding as the physical ones. Moving into completely unfamiliar environments required mental flexibility that most animals don't possess. When early humans encountered their first mammoth in Ice Age Europe, they couldn't rely on instinctive responses developed for hunting African elephants. They had to observe, experiment, learn, and adapt their behavior based on new information. This capacity for behavioral flexibility was probably the most important trait that made global expansion possible. Other large mammals that attempted to expand into new environments usually failed because they couldn't modify their behavior quickly enough to handle new challenges. Humans succeeded because they had evolved the ability to completely reinvent their survival strategies when circumstances demanded it. But individual flexibility wasn't enough. Successful expansion also required unprecedented levels of social cooperation. When a band of 30 people decided to cross into Ice Age Europe, they weren't just risking their own lives. They were betting the future of their children and grandchildren on their collective ability to master a completely alien environment. This created social pressures that had never existed before in human evolution. Groups had to maintain cooperation even when facing life-threatening challenges that no one had ever encountered. They had to share resources equitably even when those resources were desperately scarce. They had to make collective decisions about survival strategies when no one had enough experience to know what would work. The social innovations that emerged from these pressures were as important as the technological ones. Early human populations developed sophisticated systems for collective decision-making, conflict resolution, and resource distribution. They created cultural mechanisms for maintaining group identity and cooperation across multiple generations. Most importantly, they developed teaching systems that could rapidly transmit crucial survival knowledge to children and newcomers. These social innovations weren't just useful for migration, they became the foundation for all later human civilization. The same cooperative mechanisms that allowed small bands to survive in Ice Age Europe eventually scaled up to enable the construction of cities, the coordination of agriculture, and the development of complex societies. But the expansion also created new forms of human diversity that had never existed before. When populations split off from their parent groups and adapted to new environments, they didn't just change physically, they developed new ways of thinking, new social structures, new relationships with their environments. Arctic populations developed psychological adaptations for surviving months of darkness and isolation. They created storytelling traditions, artistic practices, and spiritual beliefs that helped maintain mental health during the harshest conditions. These weren't just entertainment, they were survival technologies as crucial as warm clothing or efficient hunting techniques. Desert populations developed different psychological profiles. They became expert at reading subtle environmental cues, finding patterns in apparently random landscapes, maintaining focus and direction during long journeys across featureless terrain. They developed different concepts of time and space, different relationships with risk and uncertainty. Mountain populations adapted to life in environments where small mistakes could be fatal. They became extremely cautious and methodical, developing elaborate safety protocols and risk assessment procedures. They created social structures that emphasized collective responsibility and mutual dependence. Forest populations developed intimate relationships with complex ecosystems. They became expert at recognizing thousands of plant and animal species, predicting seasonal changes, managing resources sustainably over long periods. They developed social systems based on detailed environmental knowledge and long-term thinking. Each of these adaptations created populations that were not just physically different, but cognitively and culturally distinct. The human expansion didn't just spread people across the globe, it created new ways of being human that had never existed before. The diversity that emerged from human expansion is visible today in the enormous range of human cultures, languages, and worldviews. The differences between populations aren't just superficial variations on a common theme. They represent fundamentally different approaches to understanding and interacting with the world. But this diversity emerged within a remarkably short time period. Most of the cultural and cognitive differences between human populations developed within the last 50,000 years. This represents one of the most rapid diversification events in the history of complex organisms. The speed of this diversification tells us something important about human adaptability. Our species doesn't just adapt to new environments, we transform ourselves to fit new environments while simultaneously transforming those environments to fit us. This dual adaptation process allowed humans to colonize environments that would have been impossible for any other large mammal to inhabit. Consider what happened when humans first encountered the Australian continent 50,000 years ago. They found ecosystems dominated by marsupials, animals that behaved completely differently from anything they had ever encountered. The largest predators were giant monitor lizards and flightless birds. The herbivores included kangaroos that moved by hopping, wombats that lived underground, and koalas that spent their entire lives in trees. Traditional African hunting techniques were useless in this environment. Persistence hunting doesn't work on animals that can hop faster than humans can run. Ambush hunting is difficult when prey animals have completely different behavioral patterns. Group hunting strategies designed for herd animals don't work on solitary marsupials. Early Australians had to completely reinvent human hunting. They developed new weapons, new tracking techniques, new understanding of animal behavior, but they also did something unprecedented. They began systematically modifying the Australian environment to make it more suitable for human habitation. Firestick farming wasn't just resource management, it was ecosystem engineering on a continental scale. By systematically burning different areas at different times of year, early Australians created a mosaic landscape that supported larger populations of useful plants and animals. They were actively designing the Australian environment to support human needs. This represents a completely new relationship between humans and nature. Previous human populations had adapted to existing environments. Early Australians were creating new environments that had never existed before. They were transforming an entire continent into something more suitable for human habitation. Similar processes occurred everywhere humans colonized. In Europe, humans began managing forest environments to encourage useful species and discourage dangerous ones. In Asia, they started modifying river systems to improve fishing and transportation. In the Americas, they began cultivating wild plants and managing animal populations. Within a few thousand years of arriving in any new environment, humans weren't just living in that environment, they were actively managing and modifying it. This represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between organisms and their environments that had never occurred before in the history of life on Earth. The environmental modifications created by early human populations were often so extensive that they persisted for thousands of years after the original populations disappeared. Many landscapes that we think of as natural are actually the result of human management that began tens of thousands of years ago. The Amazon rainforest contains numerous tree species that were cultivated and managed by indigenous populations for thousands of years. What appears to be pristine wilderness is actually a human-modified environment that supports higher biodiversity than truly wild forests. European forests show similar patterns. Many plant and animal communities were shaped by human management practices that began during the Ice Age. The loss of these management practices following population crashes during medieval plagues actually reduced biodiversity in many regions. North American prairies were maintained by systematic burning practices developed by indigenous populations. When European colonists suppressed these burning practices, many prairie ecosystems were invaded by forest species, fundamentally altering the landscape. This pattern of environmental modification reveals something crucial about human expansion. It wasn't just colonization, it was terraforming. Humans didn't just adapt to existing environments, they redesigned those environments to support larger human populations and more complex human societies. The terraforming process was usually so gradual that individual generations didn't notice the changes occurring. But over periods of thousands of years, human activity transformed every environment on Earth. By the time agriculture developed 10,000 years ago, most terrestrial ecosystems had already been significantly modified by human activity. This environmental modification had profound implications for other species. The megafauna extinctions that occurred wherever humans colonized weren't just the result of hunting pressure. They were the result of systematic environmental changes that made large ecosystems unsuitable for species that had evolved in pristine conditions. But the same environmental modifications that drove some species extinct also created new opportunities for others. Many plant and animal species that are now widespread and successful owe their success to human environmental management. Dogs, cats, horses, cattle, wheat, rice, corn, all of these species became successful because humans modified environments to support them. The relationship between human expansion and biodiversity is complex and nuanced. While human activity drove many species extinct, it also created new forms of biodiversity that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Human-managed environments often support different species communities than pristine environments, but they aren't necessarily less diverse or less valuable. This complex relationship between humans and nature has continued throughout human history. Every major human innovation, agriculture, urbanization, industrialization, has involved further modifications to natural environments. The human expansion that began 70,000 years ago is still continuing today as human activity transforms environments on every continent and in every ocean. But the modern phase of human expansion is different from earlier phases in crucial ways. Early human populations modified environments gradually over periods of thousands of years, allowing other species time to adapt. Modern human activity is transforming environments so rapidly that many species can't adapt quickly enough to survive. Early human environmental modifications were usually sustainable over long periods. Indigenous populations developed management practices that could maintain environmental productivity for thousands of years. Modern human activity often degrades environmental productivity, creating short-term benefits at the cost of long-term sustainability. Understanding the history of human expansion provides crucial insights for managing modern environmental challenges. Our species has always modified environments to support human needs. This isn't a recent development that we need to stop, but we need to learn from the sustainable environmental management practices that allowed early human populations to thrive for thousands of years in the same locations. The indigenous populations that successfully managed environments for millennia developed sophisticated understanding of ecological processes, sustainable resource use, and long-term planning. These aren't primitive practices that we've outgrown. They're advanced technologies that we need to rediscover and adapt for modern conditions. The story of human expansion also provides perspective on current debates about human nature and our relationship with the environment. Some people argue that humans are inherently destructive and that our environmental impact is always negative. Others argue that human activity is always beneficial and that environmental concerns are overblown. The actual history of human expansion suggests that both perspectives are wrong. Humans are neither inherently destructive nor inherently beneficial. We're inherently transformative. We change every environment we enter, usually in ways that benefit humans and some other species while harming others. The key question isn't whether human environmental impact is good or bad, it's whether that impact is sustainable and equitable. Can we modify environments in ways that support human needs without degrading the environmental systems that all life depends on? Can we ensure that the benefits of environmental modification are shared fairly rather than concentrated among small, privileged populations? These are the same questions that early human populations faced when they first colonized new environments. The populations that answered these questions successfully were the ones that survived and prospered for thousands of years. The populations that failed to develop sustainable environmental relationships were the ones that disappeared or were forced to migrate to new territories. Modern human civilization faces the same challenges on a global scale. We need to develop environmental management practices that can support current human populations while maintaining the environmental systems that future generations will depend on. We need to ensure that the benefits of environmental modification are distributed equitably among all human populations. The history of human expansion suggests that these challenges aren't impossible to solve. Our species has successfully colonized and sustainably managed environments on every continent. We have thousands of years of experience in developing environmental management practices that work over long time periods. But solving modern environmental challenges will require the same qualities that made the original human expansion successful: technological innovation, social cooperation, and willingness to completely reimagine our relationship with the environment when circumstances demand it. The expansion from Africa to every corner of the earth was the greatest achievement in human history. It demonstrated that our species can adapt to any environment, overcome any obstacle, survive any challenge. But it also demonstrated that success requires sustainable relationships with the environmental systems that all life depends on. We are the descendants of the most successful colonists in the history of life on Earth. We carry the genetic and cultural legacy of populations that successfully adapted to every environment on the planet. We have inherited the creativity, cooperation, and adaptability that made the human expansion possible. But we've also inherited the responsibility that comes with that success. We're now the dominant species on Earth, with the power to shape environments on a global scale. How we use that power will determine not just the future of human civilization, but the future of life on Earth. The story of how humans spread across the Earth isn't just a fascinating piece of natural history, it's a guide for navigating the challenges we face today. It shows us what humans can accomplish when we combine scientific understanding with social cooperation and environmental wisdom. From 10,000 people in a small corner of Africa to 8 billion people transforming the entire planet. The greatest migration in the history of life on Earth, and it's still continuing. The question now is, where will we go next, and how will we get there responsibly? The answer, as always, lies in our uniquely human ability to imagine a better future and then work together to make it real. One innovation, one cooperation, one impossible dream at a time.